Well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here to listen to our honored guest, Professor Marlise Matos, who is here all the way from the Federal University of Minas Gerais in, how many people know where Minas Gerais is? Belo Horizonte. It's sort of, how many people know where Brasilia is? Okay, it's kind of near Brasilia. Sort of out in the middle of Brazil that way. It's Brazil's third largest city, Belo Horizonte?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of the top ranked federal universities. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marlise. Marlise is one of the leading feminist scholars, foremost feminist theorists in Brazil today, I am confident in saying. She's a genuinely interdisciplinary scholar who's trained initially in psychoanalysis and then moved to sociology and is now, strangely enough, in a political science department. She has also been a leading figure in the consolidation and institutionalization of the field of feminist studies in Brazil. She was, for a number of years, director of a national network of feminist studies called Redefem. She is also currently director of one of the major institutes for feminist studies in Brazil called NEPEM, which is based at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And NEPEM just celebrated in September its 30th anniversary, so it's one of the first women's studies centers in Brazil as well. Marlise also is very active at the international level and has been particularly active in recent years with, as a collaborator and consultant with UN Women and also with the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Brazil. And is involved in, she'll be telling you, I'm sure, about a number of applied research projects that she has been engaging in that is applied research working with poor urban and rural women in various parts of Brazil. We have collaborated on a number of projects. Most recently, Marlise, I had the pleasure of having Marlise be my host during my sabbatical last year when I was on a Fulbright at her university. So she was my host, collaborator, and sometime partner in crime before and since. And so I would like you to join me in welcoming Marlise Matos.
Thank you, Sonia. Oh my gosh, so many credits. So thank you all for coming, and it's an honor. I really would like to thank Sonia Alvarez for this invitation. It's the first time I do some kind of a academic marathon in the United States. I also give the same talk in SWUS Encounter in Washington, and also in Eastern Michigan University, and now here in UMass. For me, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all.
Despite the fact that she's turning into a penguin.
Yeah, it's the first time I see so many different types of snow in my life. It's very different for a Brazilian folk, because we don't have snow in Brazil, you know. So, what I was planning to talk to you today is about the Fourth Feminist Wave in Latin America. But I would like to start remembering that on the 18th of February, we celebrated the International Day of Women of the Americas, the Day of Women of the Americas, and the anniversary of the creation of this commission, Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres, that takes part of OIS. It's the first international and intergovernmental organism of the world that holds the responsibility of civil and political monitoring women's rights all over the Americas. I'd like to come to begin my talk with this remark. And it will be a theoretical talk. You know, I'm trying this at this time to frame something about two field researchers that we did in the last 5 years. I'll tell you about that. But my objective, my intention here is to propose a theoretical framework for the experience of a fourth wave of the feminist movements in Brazil and in Latin America. I need to tell you that I do not intend to retrace the tendencies, which are many and plural, of the feminist movements in the region. This would be a philosophical undertaking that is not part of my objectives here. I will be more specifically focused on recent social and political dynamics that, from my point of view, have been configuring a new phase of Latin American feminism. This is happening in a frame of renewed decolonial struggles of different subaltern groups, and in this specific case, those of organized women in my region. I understand that the broader context of these movements in Latin America, particularly from the 2000 onward, was organized according to a new format that could briefly be described as a multimodal, a multi-scale, a multi-dimensional, and poly-centered movement of women stemming from different communities informed by feminist gender policies, which are specifically interaction with the state and with international organizations. It is worth here noting that this is distinct, in my opinion, from what is happening in the countries in the global or hegemonic north, for example. I'll try to convince you that. So I divided my presentation in 3 parts. The first one, I'll talk a little bit about the recent processes of redemocratization in Latin America, particularly from the end of the 80s, and I will pay more attention to the pink tide rise in Latin America, the election of left-wing presidents, and the research which gave foundations to these reflections. On part 2, I will introduce you to the challenge of thinking about the recent feminist radicalization of the fourth wave. And I will present you 9 of its most important characteristics. And so I will do some kind of final considerations. See if we have time. I would like to show you some pictures of this field research that we've made and some examples. It seems to be clear that this phase or wave has had important societal effects and has been leading significant political resistance in the direction of conservatives or new conservatism, a new right-wing orientation in those countries. I need to begin with this statement because I won't have time to explore these reactions here, unfortunately, but it's necessary to mark them. We are experiencing in Brazil and also, for example, in Argentina, some movements that are pressuring our democracies just right now. So breaking free from the neoliberal and chains that spread through the Latin American continent in the 90s and inaugurated the pink tide, the new leftist governments in the region, we are now seeing an agenda based on the affirmations of a feminist theoretical practical complexities that contains, in my opinion, 3 kinds of efforts. Efforts of social detraditionalization that establish a kind of societal dimension. A decolonialization of knowledge, that is the epistemological dimension of these transformations. And that's my challenge to talk all those 3 words: depatriarchalization, deracialization, and deheteronormatization.
which vary according to different levels and degrees of certain bodies in the state, but particularly in the executive branch of the state, which comprises a political dimension. As well, these transformations are also happening, in my opinion, in the society as well. So, you can see here a first table that we present the main presidents in countries that integrates Latin American Spain tide. It begins in 1988 with Venezuela and the President Hugo Chavez, and it also happening in 2009 in El Salvador with the election of Mauricio Funes. So we have 11 countries in this kind of experiences, a government with left parties on the top. So you have the name of the president's party in this last column. So, structural and contextual factors for the emergence of Latin American Spain tide is very complex. I will also address 4 factors that were, in my opinion, important to address to this discussion. The first one, it's obvious, the end of the Cold War and the consequent end of socialism, which, according to analysts, represented the opportunity to Latin American governments to finally manifest themselves once the external control of the United States on the region had damaged or had begun retreating. A second structural factor, contextual factor, is the great transformations of the social movements in the region and their new ways of relating to the state. Especially, and I will tell you a little more about that, feminist and women's movements. A third factor is the anti-neoliberal character that permitted some parties, at least initially, to preserve their alternatives and oppositional character with regard to the intense reforms that were taking place. After the emergence of the new liberal project, especially after the hard and following international financial crisis, the crisis of political institutions and political party systems was also taking place. Given the loss of legitimacy of those political parties and their traditional ways of representation, the new movements and leaderships were able finally to voice and channel their popular sense. And finally, I would like also to mention the detraditionalization or decolonialization tendencies in the region. This crisis of liberal representation and party systems are not only related to the failure of the new liberal model, they are also related to the end of traditional, even colonial, ways of state organization, of dominance and social exploitation, of very low political social inclusion, and evident monopoly, as well as of social and party elitism, expressed in the long-lasting periods of non-democratic or even democratic periods that took place in various of our countries. So, this is the first part of the first part, and now I'll go to just outline some elements of these researchers that were the sources that made me actually postulate this new way. The analytical efforts that I will briefly elaborate on here originated from 2 field research projects conducted by the center I represent here, Núcleo de Estudos e Pesquisa sobre a Mulher, MEPEM, Women's Studies Research Center at UFMG, and another one that I am also responsible to, that is the Center of Feminism and Gender Interests, Centro de Interesse Feminista e de Gênero, and where I need to recognize, influenced by the theoretical contribution and the dialogue I established with Professor Sonia Alvarez, of this university, I am having the honor to present this paper and this work, given the proximity to her recent research investigations and due to the work we have already done together as she went to Brazil, as she told you, to collaborate in this discussion. These two research projects sought to study 18 Latin American countries, and 10 of them were visited, and their respective efforts toward building more equal parameters of social justice, political representation, and gender justice. And these are the 18 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And the ones that are colored, we were locally doing the field work with interviews and many other things. The first project looked at the various aspects associated with gender justice, in particular political representation. And this field work was conducted throughout 2009 and 2010 in the 18 countries. Afterwards, semi-structured interviews were conducted and secondary sources were collected in 5 of these countries in the first phase of this research. The second project focused on public policies for women, actors, processes, and institutions that were associated in the region. It began in 2011 and ended in the beginning of 2003. During the second phase, 5 other countries were visited, where actors from the executive and legislative branches were interviewed, representatives from feminist and women's movements, and representatives from international human rights organizations. If we had time, I could talk more about this field project, but here I just would like to outline something that you can imagine that all this kind of stuff, the theoretical imagination, it's not only from my imagination, you know. So, a first step, I need to tell you that I am already aware of the criticisms directed at thinking about feminist movements according to the wave's metaphor. Its historical, spatial, and temporal limitations, as well as the fact that it is inherently anchored in a Western perspective. I also know that many will indicate and criticize me for the use of the wave metaphors as, once again, a Western position of white intellectual and bourgeois feminists. I have already partaken of these criticisms, and it permanently reminder amongst many of my concerns regarding feminism. Yet, for now, and for not having identified another metaphor capable of more appropriately grasping the dynamics of feminist movements, I will continue to adopt it, but through a critical, contingent, non-linear, and complex lens. So it's really impossible here to address in detail to the 3 preceding Latin American feminist waves. But I would like to highlight an element which distinguishes our feminist struggles from others worldwide: the anti-dictatorship struggles. During the 70s and the 80s, part of the second wave of feminism that emerged in Latin America could be located in the resistance and struggles of women against the authoritarian military rule, violence, and lack of complete citizenship within the military regimes. We can identify this as being a way feminism directly struggled against a paradoxically modernizing, militarized, and dictatorial style of capitalism. This results from the fact that a great part of the movement came from clandestine organizations from the left that were fighting against capitalism and for democracy. Furthermore, due to an important political exercise, they rejected not only the hierarchical and androcentric practices of this very left, but also against the invisibility and the lack of consideration of needs for transforming gender and racial issues into a more general political struggle. Another part of the movement was fighting for everyday questions, daily structural issues such as childcare, public transportation, protests against high prices, and so on. So from the middle of the 80s and the 90s, some countries began transitioning to democratic governments. Others, mainly in Central America, suffered long periods of internal conflicts and violent armed political struggles. The climate of the region during this period was marked by strong pressure for social groups, including women's movements, for constitutional reforms, political participation, and institutional changes. According to Pinto, the next period was marked by the third wave, characterized by a kind of diffuse feminism, which centered on different processes of institutionalization, feminist specialization, and on the importance of discussing the many differences among women and new ways of collectively organizing themselves within those differences. So, I won't have time also to describe all of the concepts that are summarized here, but it's only to tell you that it's important to mention that these three first waves have occurred, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many literature that addresses to this discussion in Latin America. But my real point is to describe for you what I am really calling fourth wave. You know, I will now go to the next part of my speech here, that when the feminist and women's movements, particularly from 2000 onwards, gained a new political face, when the pink tide emerges, a multiple feminist agenda took place, and in my opinion, another feminist wave begins in Latin America. This is a quotation of Gargalo's work. I'll just pass away, but because of the time. The first, I will present you 9 of elements or characteristics of this I am calling as fourth wave of feminist movements in Latin America. The first one is the broadening, dancing, and deepening of critical reflexive concept of human rights that now has, finally, a sex, gender, color, race, sexuality, age, generation, in addition to social class, pointed out by the feminists and the women's struggles, as well as by other social movements. Very differently from the abstract, transcendental, and liberal proposal of human dignity that sought to guide the international agenda associated with these rights, the concept, in my opinion, is now marked by an engendered, racialized perspective of human rights. A second factor or characteristic is the increased diffusion and the kind of localization of feminist struggles that is tied to a community. Rural, indigenous, traditional groups, community-based. This localization has produced an effect of diversifying and multiplying the basis of social and political mobilization from what we call in Latin America, a Via Yala, the America as seen from the south. A Via Yala is the Kuna name. It's the Kuna name which, particularly in South America, is used by indigenous leaders to define the south and north of the continent, being that America is the colonial name given to that which they identify it as their common territory. Kuna name is originated in a group which lives in the archipelagos of Panama, who speak the language of the group Chilichense and are in a strategic position of being able to see from their geographical location both the south and the north of Americas, given they are situated at the very waist of the continent. Above all, this process has reached the sphere of global and local action. In other words, it can be located in the framework which brings new meanings to national and local, to the national and the local, in terms of human rights, so that the historical legacies of patriarchy, racism, and capitalism can be finally overcome. A third characteristic is an agenda of struggles that has been strongly radicalized, not only for being part of the anti-neoliberal, democratic, participatory, and popular perspective in the region, but being strongly anti-capitalist as well. I refer here to the feminist struggles that are local and communitarian, which are associated to women coming from various traditional or originary groups. As I told you, indigenous, Amerindians, quilombolas, etc. in the region, and who continue to resist. These groups are faced to different degrees devastating phenomena such as agribusiness, mining, petroleum exploration, tourism, the implementation of hydroelectric and wind power plants, the predatory actions of the state, among others, that look to expand the frontiers of capitalist expansion. As we know, these actions have all sought to expel the population which has legally acquired the rights to participate and consult on the interests that affect them from these territories. The next factor is a significant effort to elaborate and promote particular ways of learning and education originating from an intercultural perspective and decolonialism, strongly inspired by the pedagogy of the oppressed and its methods of popular education as strong alternatives to power and hegemonic knowledge. These efforts have been used by different communities of women and are based especially on orality, visions, dreams, and other non-traditional manifestations of experience, symbolization and personification, analogies, exchanges, and observation. There is also another common feature, which is the proposal of carrying out meetings or festivals, encounters, a pedagogy of meetings based on decent, decolonializing methodologies, with a strong emphasis on corporeal experiences and the sharing of intimate experiences also, with, which function as vehicles for emancipatory feminist interactions, where new and mutual learnings take place so as to strengthen individual and community identities. These pedagogical strategies are focused on the efforts towards building and establishing a network of corporeal, symbolic, cultural elements that strengthen the ties among land, language, labor, customs, family, community, environment, and through the perspective of living well.
Postpone.
In the perspective of living well, I don't know if this translation is all right, but it's different from welfare or other kind of things. In Spanish we say buen vivir, or vivir bien. The fifth characteristic is the creation of new spaces and new repertoire of action that are correlated with the transnational community framework. Renewed activism activist feminism online, taking place through a variety of social media and alternative networks, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, and also zines, letters, audio, photography, video, etc., and which has led to a powerful feminist revival in the region, especially beginning in the 2000s with the preeminent role of the young feminists. This can be found in Brazil and in the larger Latin American context, where these feminisms have fought to establish an unquestionable intersectional feminist agenda, anti-everything, you know? Anti-ageism, anti-lesbophobia, anti-transphobia, anti-racism, anti-speciesism. I don't know if it's this,
Yes, that's right.
this way, that looks to create new liberating and horizontal spaces in a powerful manner. These networks have given new meaning to struggles for more gender justice in the region. So another characteristic is the focus on feminist side streaming, how feminism has spread horizontally, or, in the terms presented by Professor Sonia Alvarez, the horizontal fluxes of feminism. In other words, a perspective that highlights the continuity of gender discrimination, but goes beyond that, to equally value the principles of non-discrimination based on race, ethnicity, generation, nationality, class, or religion, among others. This process refers to the recognition of other feminisms that are profoundly intertwined and sometimes controversially tangled up in local, national, and global struggles for social, sexual, generation, communitarian, racial justice. The same women who made up the basis of the hegemonic feminisms in the 90s and that frequently were treating different women as the others, rural or urban workers, younger women, women of African descent, indigenous women, lesbians, the poor, and so on, were and are now the ones responsible for a new effort of translation, which signals the transformation of many of the essential nodes of feminism. Now women are being feminists inside other social movements, not only in feminist movements, such as rural movements, environmentalist movements, trade unions movements, within the political parties, youth movements, and etc. Another characteristic is the focus on feminist mainstreaming, what Sonia calls the vertical fluxes, so the verticalization, which brings visibility to the eminence of new ways of relating to the state and in its many institutions, as well as to dynamics associated with new wave of feminist theorizing. In this sense, the efforts involve the participatory construction of transversal, intersectional, and intersectoral actions for institutional departicalization, de-racialization, and de-heteronormatization. Overall, this effort focused on very decolonializing of state institutions, as well as other political institutions such as parties, for example. Starting from the assumption that the state institutions and other political institutions are patriarchal, racist, and heteronormatively oriented, this new phase established a contest dialogue with the state institutions that is completely reshaping public policies for women all over the region. Just to mention here, we find that all of the countries we researched, the 18 countries, had institutional mechanisms for implementing women's policies, and all of them had national plans or programs about public policies for women. And we did not expect this to be as this way. Another characteristic is a new transversal and intersectional theoretical understanding of this phenomenon related to gender, to race, sexuality, class, and generation has led to the need for thinking about micro and micro strategies of actions that are articulated, integrated, and created by both state and civil societies. as a result of a new intersectional, transversal, multimodal, polycentric feminism is finally established. So, finally, a renewed interest in the interconnections among thought, theory, and feminist movements. And I am trying to elaborate this discussion in the perspective of a construction of a critical emancipatory field of differences, which not only intends to bring about a profound theoretical reformulation with a strong emphasis on contemporary, theoretical, and critical feminist decolonial traditions, but also seeks to create a new framework open to the possibility, finally, we hope so, I am an optimistic, of a cosmopolitan, emancipatory, and critical feminism. Here it's important to emphasize that we are working with the colonialist Latin American theoretical perspective that focuses on the concept of coloniality of power. Originally, Alberto Quijano and Lander were responsible, and strongly grounded in the category of oppressed, as previously discussed by Frady and Dussel. The colonial power structure not disappeared in its effects with the defeat of the colonialism in the region. On the contrary, this power structures in Rio was and it is still in the framework within in which we Latin Americans operate most of our social, cultural, intersubjective, and even corporeal relationships. So, finally, I can and I need to attest to the privileges I have had for being white and from the academy and the university, which allows me to try to critically reflect on such dynamics, and thus may enable me to give more justice and recognition to the democratic and democratizing advancements led by the multiple Latin American feminisms in the region, without always really fully knowing if I have been able to do that. And this is something that greatly and continuously concerns me. The effort here is to try to take seriously the strategy of decolonializing feminism. The strength of this new wave, from my perspective, seeks to definitely find other and new ways of living, since it understands multiple feminisms as active as strategies of the creation of the living well, or the buen vivir. It is also a process of meeting other American modernities, which are deeply complex, open, and counterinsurgent, as well as they have their own projects for emancipation and political ideals. Despite not having the time to explore these issues here, and before ending this reflection, I will present you some significant challenges that I have been concerned with. These challenges are multiple and complex, as well as completely intertwined. They involve the efforts of a political construction that should seriously take into account, first, a new design and/or theoretical analytical framework that is broader and more suitable for the new wave, critical emancipatory field of differences, a task I have already undertaken in a pluriversal perspective. And pluriversal here is also a concept of the perspective of the colonial theory in Latin America. An additional methodological effort beyond the numerous critiques of feminist epistemology that includes a new pedagogical design, a renewed kind of pedagogy of subaltern emancipation that has its focus on the axis of participatory counter-disagreement and dialogue dissent. Another challenge is a set of fundamental epistemological efforts to build strategies of decolonializing and emancipatory translation among the diverse Latin American languages. And like here, this effort is in course in Latin America, and Sonia and Claudia Lima Costa already have been developed some important contributions to this efforts of translation. And then an additional communication effort where one can think on the ways, formats, or strategies for promoting in a decolonial manner the translation and the dialogues disagreements in order to collaborate in the construction of a cosmopolitan, emancipatory, and critical feminism. It seems clear to me that the extent of these transformations would not go unnoticed by the hegemonic forces in the region. However, if the dynamics of interaction between retraditionalization and decolonialization and their respective actors are intersectional, so must be the struggles and production of knowledge about them. Paying attention to the new settings of new conservative values that have resurfaced in Latin America, and this is a concern that I am really occupied with, it seems equally strategic to think of encouraging articulated struggles among different social movements and within movements, multiplying articulations with the new forms of online activism and through networks, particularly with the renewed young feminism in the region. Establishing strategic ties with young leaders to renew the efforts of resensiting the older leaders in the region. Strengthening the struggles for definitive reshaping of the state as a secular and finally decolonialized. Strengthening the strategies of building theories and knowledge that are equally decolonializing. This involves believing in an academic privilege that can also be converted into an affirmation, recognition, and consolidation of the democratic Latin American process, whereby institutions do not only exist on paper and or are repeated traditions and colonializing practices of a liberal Western elite and that excludes real and effective citizenship. It involves claiming that there is finally a permanent process towards guaranteeing that each citizen will have the effective conditions to exercise his or her rights, and that these rights can be lived and experienced both in form and content, particularly if the citizen is female, indigenous, black, gay, lesbian, transsexual, young, and poor, etc. Thanks. So just for you to have a dimension of these people I am talking about, I have some photos of another research project that is taking place in Brazil now. I just finished it last year. It's about Bolsa Família. And these are the kind of communities I am talking about. This is a rural community in Vale do Jequitinhonha that is one of the most poor regions in Brazil and probably all over the world. You know, this is a rural community. And I would like to mention also a strong movement that is taking place in Brazil, and this year, that is the Marcha das Mulheres Negras, that also are taking Buen Vivir as a moat, as something that we are thinking about and working with. And this is the women that I am talking about. It's the rural women, and also another rural community. And this is an indigenous community that is an indigenous village that is called Cinta Vermelha Jundiba, and also in Vale do Jequitinhonha. And this is a quilombo, a traditional ancestral strategy of resistance. You may see here a very huge differences, very different structure of this community. It is very, very poor. It's the poorest place I've ever been in my life. You know, they don't have houses in the same way that this one we have. You know, they live in a condition that is really incredible. And you see the houses. Their houses are just like that. And this is in this Quilombola village. There's the only part of the state that exists in this community is a school, a Montessori school, with only one teacher, and the teacher teaches for children of 9, 6, 7, 8, 9 ages, just to 19, you know, in the same time. It's completely unacceptable, but this is the thing that were in the walls of this little school.
Position.
This is the position.
This is the position of who struggles to not only be an object, but a subject, but also a subject of history.
And this other one I found in the indigenous village.
Feminism never killed anybody. Machismo kills every day.
I didn't put it there, you know. So now I think I'll give you, if you want to see some examples that are not from Brazil. They are from other countries. In the I had enough time to translate it. It is in Spanish, but you can just see that we have many of these initiatives all over the Latin American countries. You know. This is indigenous feminisms in some places. Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, and communitarian. I would like to mention this. This concept, depatriarchalization, it's not my concept. I found it in the research when we went to Bolivia. It's a Bolivian concept. In Bolivia, they also have a ministry for women policies, and inside this ministry, you have a unit of depatriarchalization of the state. It's a concept that they use, and the indigenous people used also. Other kinds of examples, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and in Peru, rural feminisms in Brazil, Marcha das Margaridas, in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Peru, and so on. That's it. Thank you.
Why don't I help you take questions?
Yes.
Discreetly stand over here. Questions, I'm sure we must have.
Question about when you were talking about the policies, and you said that every country had policies related to women's lives and women's issues. What variation did you see? What were those policies like? What were some of them actually being implemented? Can you say more about that?
Okay. Just
Vamos pegar sorry, let's take a few other questions. Let's like a couple more questions. Do you have a question?
Oh, no.
I have a question.
Marta.
I'd like to know what's the usefulness of thinking about these movements from the perspective of the waves. What is useful or thought-provoking about, you know, depicting this movement as a fourth wave, and how does it relate to the third wave, or what contributions or continuities or differences does it imply? And I would also like to know, how do these movements conceive of cosmopolitanism that you mentioned is an aspect of this new wave?
Yes, I was thinking when you were mentioning the concept of buen vivir, that it also resonated with the movement for reproductive justice here within the U.S. I don't know if you're familiar with that movement. The notion of reproductive justice was created by some African American women that felt that the pro-choice movement was just focusing on abortion and ignoring a lot of other issues. So like broadening, you know, the idea of just focusing on a particular issue, and like they actually talk about, you know, the right to have a child, to not to have a child, to raise a child in a safe environment with all, you know, the...
What's the name of the concept?
Reproductive justice.
Justicia reproductiva in Spanish. And it really resonated when you were talking about like buen vivir. But yeah, if you're not familiar with the concept, you might not be able, but I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, if they had the same, you know, connection that I made in my mind.
Agustin, is yours related, or should we wait for the next round?
Yeah, I guess it's around the same. I was, I mean, I really like the presentation.
Dá para se escutar?
Lots of
Fala um pouquinho mais alto.
Huh?
Mais alto.
Okay.
It's impossible.
I really like the presentation for lots of reasons, including that, you know, I have a lot of affinity with the perspective. I also use the decolonial perspective, etc. And you know, I see that you highlight the more critical emancipatory dimensions. And I was wondering how you conceptualize this fourth wave in terms of using Sonia Alvarez's conceptualization of a field within which there is also, besides side streaming and the emancipatory dimension, there is also the mainstreaming, and you know all the ways in which not only feminism but women's subjects within the politics are actually integrated into different kind of mainstream, including the pink side of the mainstream.
Okay. So,
And one more. Let's just go ahead and take one more from Anne.
Yeah, this relates to some of the things that have been talked about, but the idea of intersectionality, I'm wondering if you would comment on there being a tension in that concept between a kind of universalizing perspective. For example, Gloria Anzaldúa talks about the queer in me of all races and so on. So she uses her particular position as a Chicana feminist to make a connection across to other queers and other positions. So that's universalizing. But then there's the historicizing aspect of intersectionality, where you're really talking about one local either community or group of oppressed within the community. And I'm wondering how your pluriversal intersectional decolonial perspective deals with these tensions, and it connects to that cosmopolitanism question as well.
As perguntas pequenininhas.
oh yeah, so easy to answer all of this. So thank you all for those questions, and I don't have the answer for all of them, you know. I'm sorry, but this is a work in progress. I just arrived in this new frame, and I am thinking of many old other perspectives. So about the public policies for women in Latin America. In Latin America, we have a CEPAL, I don't know if you, the Commission for
ECLAC.
ECLAC here in English, that they have already classified that this mechanism, this is those institutional mechanisms for women policies in the region, and they really vary too much. We have some plans and some policies that are seriously being implemented, but we are not yet in the stage that evaluating the impacts of this implementation in the public policy agenda. You know, they are very recent in the region. It is important to note that most part of these plans are participatory and democratic effort of these movements to engage in articulations with the state. I need to mention, I can mention for you the example of Brazil, that we have a cycle of conferences that is something that is very specific. You know, you begin in the local stage in the communities or in the municipalities. Then you have representation of the state and representatives of of social movements and women's and feminist movements. They open a space of debating about the public policies for women, and this goes to a regional perspective and then to a national perspective. In Brazil, we have already had 3 national conferences for women, and we have 3 national plans for women. There are the result of this complex, tense, disputed debate, and not always a dialogue between the state and between women's movements. So this, the difference I see is this also have many differences between the countries. Some are very participatory, these initiatives of building these plans and building these policies, and in the other countries you don't have this same participatory tendency. No?
Can you give some interesting examples, maybe 1 or 2 of something that caught
I can tell you there are important, there are initiatives that are universal. So education, health, reproductive rights, quotas in the parliaments. We have policies for traditional and communitarian people, as quilombolas and black people. You have communicational efforts to build policies, and we have environmental issues, including people that lives in the forest, people that lives from fishing. It varies very much, but you have much differences between the countries, and the policies are also very diverse, you know. I think the next step, which I would love to do, is to see that this, all of this process of building this de-traditionalization of the state, this depatriarchalization and so on, is effectively having impacts on women's lives. Because women really did participate of the processes. But it's always the state, you know. It's always, in Latin America, a traditional, a colonial, and yet an authoritarian state that is responsible for implementing all those things. And we have problems because if you have only a part of the state that is sensitive for these questions, you have all the others that are really not. So you will probably have problems in implementation and the impacts of this kind of stuff. So, as the girl runs out, no, she's here. So, I will try to respond, to answer the question of the cosmopolitanism and with the historicism that she also asked me, and the pluriversal decolonial perspective. So this is a concept that Aníbal Quijano used, no? And he created this concept. I usually has adopted another concept that was contingent universal. This concept is from, I don't know, let me try to remember the authors. Zizek, Laclau, and Butler. They developed this concept of a contingent universal. Just to try to talk about this paradoxical tendencies. You have the simultaneously something that is localized and that is also universalized. And this is a strategy, a theoretical strategy to think about a post-dialectical moment. So you don't have only two things in opposition. You have many and plural things in simultaneous and paradoxically oppositions, you know. So you have to think about the concepts to address to this multidimensional struggles. So the pluriversal is something that is a concept that is trying to deal with the localized perspectives of people, what they really think, what they really experiences, in an effort to be finally exposed, not as an example that will be hegemonic for all the universe, but as a perspective that can, for example, helps other communities, other people, so other feminist movements worldwide. You know, it's an effort that is a connection in the theoretical effort with the experience and lived things of the people in the ground, in the grassroots of the movements. This is not a thing that is in the ether. Now, you know, it's something that is grounded and bottom up. I don't know if I have explained it. But Quijano explained this much more better than I do, you know. The similarities in the reproductive justice and Buen Vivir. Buen Vivir is for people of the Andes